when you look at all the benefits that you're talking about when people start composting, or as a society we start composting, and when you look at the impacts that not composting and sending every uh, landfills, it's kind of a no-brainer what we should do, but obviously it's not that simple. It's not just applied, or it's not like you can just say all these
Yeah.
things and that's enough to convince everybody. So with that in mind, how can we normalize the action of composting?
I mean, I think there's like policy level answers to that question, but there's also like on the ground interpersonal, conversations that need to be had. Um, I think on an interpersonal level, right? Like I think about, in my parents' lifetime, recycling became a thing, right? Like there were not blue bins everywhere 60 years ago, 50 years ago, right? That was a sheer force of will that normalized what otherwise was viewed as like this weird hippy dippy nonsense, right? And now we've got people like furious attending city council meetings, being like, "Why can't I recycle my plastic bottle?" And it's all because of like geopolitical nonsense, right? And because we're not really good at recycling. I see no reason why like those same people aren't as infuriated by the very idea that like you can throw food away, right? Like there was a moment in my life where it just like it clicked. It's like if you think about the land that is dedicated to growing food, the labor that goes into growing food, the water that is used to cultivate that food, the trucking that goes into moving that food around, processing that food, the refrigeration used, and then you bring it home and throw it away, like it's absurd. It's totally absurd, right? It's also like designed to be recycled, right? And so like you're depriving it at its very core from like what it is intended to do, right? And so I think that like while I may not have been very convincing there, right? I think that like when you can walk people through that process, it becomes like, oh yeah, like that this is weird that like we like robbed the earth of the resources it produced. Um, I think that unfortunately we've got policy in place that makes doing that very easy. Right. So one policy that I advocate for whenever I get a microphone is to adopt pay as you throw. So this is a waste management policy that essentially charges more money for people who generate more waste and less money for those who generate less waste. And in this case, yard waste and food waste would not be considered waste at all. It's a resource, right? And so if you're sending lots of stuff to landfill, you should pay more, right? But we have plenty of clients that we work with who only have their dumpster or their household trash picked up like once a month because so much of what they're diverting or are producing can be recycled or composted. And yet they pay the same amount of money as their neighbor who's filling up 3 trash cans once a week. Like that's fundamentally makes no sense. And so I think that that's like a larger policy level that will help to like use economic forces to encourage people to waste less. Um, so, um, so I think that's that. Yeah, I mean, normalizing this requires a whole host of solutions, and I think that we're in some small way we're trying to normalize it. We often say that like we need to both point out the problem and then offer the antidote at the same time, because I think it's this like invisible tsunami, right? Like 40% of all of the food that's grown in this country is thrown away. That's insane, right? And yet like we can all like float through life not having to acknowledge that ever.
So building off of that at more of an at-home kind of level, do you have any tips on how students can compost at home without attracting undesirable animals to their backyards?
Work with smaller animals, namely worms. So in college, what I did, I lived in Chicago, didn't have a yard. I had a porch though. And so I was able to build like a vermicomposting bin. And so essentially vermicomposting is like using worms to break down organic matter in place of composting, right? And so I was able to, for less than probably $20, order a bunch of worms, get bins from Home Depot or Lowe's, and I lived with 3 people, and all of our food scraps went in that bin, and the worms ate it all, right? So I think there's that, right? But I think that like a thing we really want to encourage people to conceive of is that a lot of the food waste that we encounter at Rust Belt is very preventable, right? So think about like how to minimize the amount of waste that you just generate in the first place, rather than being like, I have all this food scraps, now what do I do with it? Like, have less food scraps, right? And the way that that happens is by meal planning. It's by knowing the importance or significance of expiration dates. It's eating in season. It's regrowing vegetables that can be regrown, like green onions and celery and things like that. It's learning how to ferment and pickle to extend the shelf life of things. There's a whole bevy of things, right? And so make stocks, right, and soups. And so yeah, so I mean, like we have this really self-deprecating business model where we quite literally are challenging our clients to put us out of business. Like I think that food waste is the dumbest problem in the world, and everyone that we work with can do a better job to minimize the amount of food waste that they produce. So when it's unavoidable do we want to be picking it up.
So you said worms. So like approaching it on a smaller level, more so than, a backyard composting bin where you have like squirrels and chipmunks and any animal that might be interested in that. It would be like targeting that smaller approach first with composting, and then it may be growing past that, kind of in total passing that major composting ideal, having that huge area in your backyard.
Yeah. So I think that pests are a real concern, right? Often, I mean, I'll speak specifically to like people who compost in their backyard. Um, when they when they encounter pests, it's largely because they're not composting correctly. Um, Essentially, a well-maintained compost pile should be generating heat. That heat wards off lots of pests. And you should if your compost pile gets cooking the way that it should, which is like within 24 to 48 hours of establishing it, by the time like it first of all, it shouldn't be emitting odor because you're using an appropriate amount of carbon. It shouldn't be like leaking water because you're managing the moisture. And it should be getting really hot, so it shouldn't be accommodating to mice or vermin to like want to get in there. It will literally burn them. And so it's a bad answer, right? But like I think generally people who do composting and run into pest issues, like it usually is like a very quick fix to try and remedy what is the source of these pests, right? And it's usually well, you're kind of doing it wrong. So maybe not a satisfying answer, but the one that we've seen more often.
That's the honesty of it.